So, if you joined me last time, we were discussing the Articles of Confederation and the idea that in the aftermath of the American Revolution, not everybody was on the same page with respect to what kind of government we should or should not have. The Articles of Confederation established a very weak central government, a form of government where your state government would be far more relevant and far more meaningful. You can understand where the American colonists were coming from in 1777 when they adopted the Articles. In that year, we were fighting a big, strong, centralized power. Leading up to that year, we didn't like what that big, strong, centralized power was doing to us and what we perceived to be our rights. And we said, when we're in charge, we're not going to stand for this kind of thing. So you can understand how they would establish a weak, centralized power in the aftermath of the American Revolution. The problem is the Articles of Confederation proved themselves to be terribly, terribly inefficient pretty early on in American history. Um, we discussed three reasons for this, and all of them revolve around this idea that there were certain essential powers that the Articles just never gave the federal government: the ability to tax people, the ability to resolve differences between the states, and the ability to regulate external trade. All of these issues were very pressing issues, and in the end, what they're going to do, guys, is they're going to give rise to what we know of as a nationalist faction. These are individuals like John Adams, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. These are your nationalist factions, but more importantly, these are the people that understand that while on paper the Articles of Confederation sound like a great idea, the problem is they were a disaster when it comes to the reality of the political situation. Um, in 1784, you begin to see these nationalists, if you will, assembling themselves in Philadelphia in what comes to be known as the Philadelphia Convention. The whole point of the convention is to decide various ways, find different ways, develop them to strengthen the powers of the federal government, and at the same time preserve specific liberties and freedoms of people of the states. A much more difficult task than it might sound. There were plenty of individuals that made their opinions heard in this process, including a guy from Virginia by the name of James Madison. Madison was a proponent of pretty extreme centralized power. The plan that he's going to present in the convention is going to come to be known as the Virginian Plan. He was, after all, from Virginia, and it would have given the federal government almost monarchical-like powers, powers that were akin to a king. Any law that was coming out of the various states, for example, if the federal government didn't like it could knock it right down. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So the Virginia plan was a little bit of a tough sell when it comes to the people. Another plan that gets floated around is a plan that ultimately comes to be known as the New Jersey Plan. And I always like to think of New Jersey's plan as a more kinder, gentler, softer version of the Virginia Plan. It strengthened core concepts of the federal government, and it kind of cleaned up the mess of the Articles of Confederation, but it did so while it preserved, shall we say, enough wiggle room for the states to preserve their own uniqueness and individual liberties, if you will. So ultimately, it's going to be the New Jersey Plan that is adopted, and it will become, think of it sort of like an outline for what will become known as the Constitution. More of that in just a second. But for right now, we still have some really important questions to wrestle with when it comes to exactly what type of government we're going to have, and it begins at the legislative level. Now, for those of you that have taken a government class, or maybe you are taking a government class, you'd be able to tell me there are three components of the federal government. You've got your executive branch of government, that would be the president, that enforces the laws. You've got your judicial branch of government. They say what the law is, they interpret the law. And today what we're going to talk about would be the legislative branch of government. They make the laws, they legislate. Now, there's a couple different ways that we could do this, and different democracies do it differently. Example, early on in Pennsylvania's history, they adopted an approach that comes to be known as a unicameral House system. The House being the legislative branch of government, where representatives are sent to make laws and decide what laws need to be repealed. Uni, meaning one, there was one House. And so this had the advantage of being very efficient when it comes to there's a law that's proposed, it's voted on, it either passes or it fails. If you pay attention to politics these days, what you've got is gridlock. If one side says it's white, the other side is determined to say that it's black, and nothing ever gets done. The downside of a unicameral House where things get voted on and adopted or not adopted quickly is that there's not a whole lot of time for debate, and every once in a while, some might even say it's more often than that, you get a bad law. You get a bad law because it has not seen enough eyes, there has not been enough debate, and it hasn't jumped through enough hoops before it has become an actual law. The flip side of this coin is ultimately what we will adopt, a bicameral House, two houses, right? An upper house and a lower house. The upper house in the United States legislative branch, Congress, that would be what you call the Senate. The lower house, I'm going to spend a second or two on them. That would be the House of Representatives. Now, this is what sometimes is referred to as the People's House, because the people, at least initially, elected their members of Congress, their House of Representatives members, directly. And so it had a direct one-to-one correlation with the people. The advantage of doing it this way, bicameral, is that it's got more checks and more hoops for laws to jump through before they can become actual laws. Example. Somebody proposes a law where everyone has to wear pink flip-flops on Friday. Stupid law, but just hear me out. Let's say that it goes through the House of Representatives and they say, we'll adopt it. We like this idea. They have to send it to the Senate for approval. Unlike a bicameral system, unlike a unicameral system, it's not instantaneous law. It still has to go through the Senate. And senators can toss this around and chew on it a little bit and say, you know what, this is a ridiculous law and we don't like it, and so no, we're not going to adopt it. They can throw it back to the House, tell them to revise it, or tell them to scrap the idea altogether. And so that's the advantage of a bicameral system. You'll catch more bad laws. You'll debate these laws more thoroughly before they can actually see the light of day. The downside, of course, is it's going to take a lot more time to get things done, and it doesn't work as smoothly, let alone as cleanly as we might like to think it does. Ultimately, as you probably know, we do settle on this idea of a bicameral system, a House of Representatives and a Senate in the upper house. Now, in the House, we begin debating how many representatives each state should get. Should everybody get the same amount? Well, the bigger states like New York, Philadelphia, Virginia, they said, absolutely not. We have more people, they need more representation than your smaller states like Rhode Island or South Carolina, so the bigger states should have more people. And of course, that led the smaller states to rebel and say, well, what about our interests? What about the tyranny of the majority? Simply because something is popular doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean that it's okay for you to force your will down our throats simply because there are more of you than there are of us. And so we're at a sticking point here. We have come to the realization that we need to take everyone's interests into account, but at the same time, the larger states do raise a very important point. In a state like New York with a lot of people, a law that comes out is going to affect a lot more New Yorkers than it would be anything else. So ultimately what we're going to do is compromise, but for the time being, I'd like you to understand that in the House of Representatives, the amount of congressmen, the amount of representation you get is based on how many people live in your state. If you have a big state like New York, you get lots of representatives. If you have a small state like South Carolina, you only get a handful of representatives. So, the big states will win this round, but as I said before, we do compromise. Many of your smaller states, and by smaller I mean population basis, they happen to be in the South, and of course slavery was very, very important in the South. I think it is only fair to say that at the time that the Constitution is being discussed and ratified, there's only one non-slave state in the country, and that's Massachusetts. More of that a little bit in the semester. But for the time being, the biggest cries against directly proportional representation, meaning based on population, they're coming from the South, especially from states like South Carolina, which did not have a very large white population. To compromise, because we needed 9 out of the first 13 states to ratify this Constitution before it can become the law of the land. So it's not as simple as telling those smaller states like South Carolina, sit down and shut up. We needed them, and therefore we needed to appeal to them. The compromise that we make, what I call the Great Compromise, is that population determines how much representation you have in the House, but each state, no matter how big or how small, will only get 2 senators. So a big state like Virginia, 2 senators. Small state like Rhode Island, 2 senators. Big state like Massachusetts, at least population-wise, 2 senators. Small state like North Carolina, 2 senators. And so theoretically what this does is it balances out the advantage that the more populated states had in the lower house by giving those smaller states a level playing field in the upper house, the Senate. People like South Carolina were still not satisfied. And I think it's pretty obvious what they were worried about. They were worried about a law that would come out that potentially could make slavery illegal. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but one day. And so really what they wanted was to shore up their representation in the House of Representatives, to make it pretty sure that no law would ever come out that would threaten that institution that was so vital to South Carolina's economy. And so what they said that they wanted was to start counting their slaves and using them to bolster up, to bump up their representatives in Congress, in the House of Representatives. And your bigger states, especially your northern states like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, said, well, you're not counting your slaves when it comes to voting, and therefore they don't really need representation if you're not going to allow them to vote and have citizenship rights, generally speaking. And so once again, what we did is we compromised. Keep in mind, we need as many states, 9 in particular, as possible for this Constitution to be ratified. What we came up with is going to be known as the 3/5 clause. Slaves would not be counted as one whole human body. They would be counted as 3/5 of a citizen. This made the South happy, or South Carolina in particular happy, because they did get a few more representatives out of this. And it made states like Massachusetts happy, or at least happier, because it was not a one-to-one directly proportional representation. And for the most part, they still got more in terms of representatives in the House. The Constitution in particular. What I need you to understand about the Constitution is actually very simple. What the Constitution would amount to is the supreme law of the land. It applies to all of the states everywhere, and if it's written down as a national law in the Constitution, you have to follow it. There's no picking and choosing. In short, what it's going to do is it's going to establish a strong federal government. Write that down. A strong federal government. Whereas the Articles of Confederation established a weak central government, the Constitution will fix the Articles by establishing a strong federal government. More importantly, what the Constitution is proposing to do is allow the federal government to tax the people directly. It's allowing the federal government to resolve differences between the states. In this way, the federal government would have the final say when it comes to border disputes between New York and New Jersey. Lastly, and this is very important, the Constitution allowed Congress to regulate external trade between the United States and France, for example. If the House of Representatives and the Senate approved of a law that made French imports taxable, then that was applicable both in Massachusetts as well as in Virginia, irregardless of whatever states had to say about it. Now, before we can have the Constitution become the supreme law of the land, we have to have 9 out of the original 13 states sign off on it or ratify it. In some of your more modestly populated states, Massachusetts, that would be 1. This is more or less a slam dunk. It's not ever very much of a question in states like that. But New York and Virginia were holdouts. The reason why is pretty simple. Neither New York nor Virginia needed the United States as much as the United States needed New York and Virginia. And so, what those two entities were very worried about would be your smaller states kind of ruling over them. Why would they go ahead and sign up for something like this when they really didn't need the smaller states as much as the smaller states needed them? And so ultimately, there's going to be a series of papers that come out that come to be known as the Federalist Papers. They're written by two individuals, James Madison and especially Alexander Hamilton. The Federalist Papers are articles that began appearing in New York newspapers that were designed to convince New Yorkers of the advantages and good ways that the Constitution would protect their rights and their liberties. In short, the Federalist Papers were designed to get New Yorkers to ratify the Constitution by convincing them that they needed a stronger federal government. Probably the most famous example, or at least in this class, the most relevant example that we point to, would be Madison's Federalist Number 10, where he talks about things called factions. Factions, we would probably call them special interest groups that attempt to manipulate governments by getting them to adopt policies that are near and dear to their own hearts. It's easy to do this, or at least Madison proclaims it's easy to do this when you've got a small federal government, but when you have a larger federal government that's more powerful, that becomes more and more difficult for factions to be able to get away with this. And so therefore, you ought to adopt a stronger federal government and ratify the Constitution. Ultimately, this works, and by 1788, the Constitution does in fact become the law of the land. As I said before, and as you're looking at right now in this PowerPoint slide, we get those 9 states by 1788. And the Constitution does become the supreme law of the land, and the big part about all of this is that the Constitution really does save the United States. And we were drowning in debt and no real way to, pay down that debt. The Constitution fixed that by allowing the federal government to tax the people all around the United States directly. But those bigger states, especially New York, did insist on a Bill of Rights, what you call the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, to protect civil rights and civil liberties. They were very concerned that this strong federal government would soon become tyrannical and would begin trampling upon their rights, and you would be right back to where you started from with the Stamp Act in 1765. We would have to do this thing all over again. And so the Bill of Rights is what I want to conclude our conversation with. Simply put, what the Bill of Rights do is they protect American civil rights and civil liberties. They are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, the first 10 changes. But maybe a better way of thinking about them would be laws that Congress would not pass. I repeat, laws that Congress would not pass. Let me take you through a couple of these 10 amendments. As a matter of fact, we're going to go through all 10 of them, some more thoroughly than others. The First Amendment guarantees the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, free press, free religion, freedom to petition one's government. Let's talk about freedom of religion here for a second. There is no law that Congress can pass that would make one religion the official religion of the United States. We've always understood this as a separation between church and state. And so if you have a friend that gets all in a huff about a nativity scene around Christmas time, a nativity scene being on the fire department's lawn, this is why they're mad. We've always understood the First Amendment to separate church, i.e. religious symbols, from the state, in other words, the fire department. So these are laws that Congress will not pass, and that's why we generally do not have an official state religion. The Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms. The Second Amendment was coming out of the Revolutionary period, And we needed militias. The Second Amendment starts out by proclaiming, in order to maintain a well-regulated militia, Congress will not pass a law that denies these militiamen the ability to assemble arms and keep them in their homes. Now that has ebbed and flowed and has changed over the course of American history. But again, this is a law that Congress will not pass. You can still own guns. The Third Amendment, conditions on quartering soldiers. Congress will never pass a law that makes you put up soldiers in your own house, responding directly to our experience in the Revolutionary time period. The Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment has to do with illegal searches and seizures. Once again, responding directly from the Revolutionary period and James Otis's railing against the writs of assistance, where British officers would stop these American ships and look through them using a general search warrant. Now, if you suspect somebody is in the process of breaking the law, you have to have either probable cause or you have to have a warrant from a judge and prove your case in court. So you can't just stop somebody because they have a dirty look on their face and search them, pat them down. The Fifth Amendment. You have the right to not bear witness against oneself. And so one of the first things that a police officer will tell you when he or she puts you under arrest is you have the right to remain silent, meaning that you don't have to be forced into a confession. You can also refuse to answer questions in a court of law. If one were to plead the fifth in court, what that means is you respectfully refuse to answer that question based on the idea that it may incriminate you. It may not, but it may incriminate you. The Sixth Amendment, you have the right to a trial, a right to a speedy trial. That might sound a little bit strange, almost like a gas station coffee or something like that, but speedy was in there for a very specific reason, and the reason was you can't just throw somebody in jail and let them rot there. You either have to formally arraign them, tell them what they're being charged with, larceny, loitering, whatever the case is, or you have to release them. There's a shelf life. You can't just keep somebody indefinitely in jail, not legally anyway. The Eighth Amendment guards against cruel and unusual punishment. You can inflict corporal punishment in specific cases because we've got the Eighth Amendment and it guards against cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment, the rule of the Constitution. If it's written down in the Constitution, it's the law of the land. It's the law of the land in Massachusetts. It's the law of the land of Texas, California, Florida, Illinois. You get the idea. But if it's not, that's where the 10th Amendment comes into play. What the 10th Amendment does is it says if the Constitution does not specifically reference it, then at that point it is up to the states. And so the states do, in fact, have the right to produce their own laws if the Constitution doesn't have it directly stated in its document. And so collectively what the Bill of Rights are going to do, guys, is they're going to protect our civil rights and civil liberties. And these are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And they're important because without them, it's very probable that the United States would not have survived to its 10th birthday. States like New York and Virginia were very concerned with smaller states now that they had, to some extent, equal representation in lawmaking bodies, ramming provisions and policies down their throats. So we've got a fully functioning legislative branch of government. But we're still not quite to the point of a government that will service the needs of the people. We still have very important components of the government to create. Probably most importantly, the executive branch of government. We still need to elect our first president, and we still need a judicial branch, okay? And so that's where we're going to pick it up the next time we meet.